Hey,
All right, so we're live, but we'll just give people a couple of minutes to find us here, just starting a couple of minutes early.
let me tweet out the link.
Yeah, between you both, you command a very devoted social media presence. That's great.
We both talk a lot of trash.
There's that. We have opinions.
Why else would you go into social media?
That wouldn't exactly.
So I will start with some announcements and then read an obituary. Today's a special one. And then introduce you both, and then we'll move into questions.
All right. There's a dog outside of the office door. Very put out that she's not inside. Hopefully she stays quiet.
On COVID calls, we've had all kind of visitors enter the frame, so don't have to worry.
As it should be.
One of the most astounding moments was last month. I was doing a session with an ornithologist from the Academy of Natural Sciences, and we were in the middle of our discussion, and he said, "Oh, I hear he identified a bird in my yard from listening to it through." It's one of the most amazing things that's happened to me this year. And I was like, wow, all this information sharing in ways we're not used to even in these discussions. The ambiance sometimes comes through too.
And
well, why don't we go ahead and get
expertise.
Yeah,
experts are experts, it turns out.
Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. As I was saying, we started a minute or so early just to enable Facebook and Periscope to join us, which is new. So I'm going to get us going today. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 79th of the COVID Calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today we have a discussion of fiction and writing in the COVID-19 pandemic with Malka Older and Malka's brother, Daniel Jose Older. You can catch COVID Calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. As of today, you can also watch COVID Calls on Facebook Live and on Periscope. I'd like to welcome new viewers and listeners to the broadcast. You can hear COVID Calls anytime, recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere else that you get podcasts. And if you're wondering what COVID Calls is all about, please be sure to check out our introductory episode on Podbean. It's there as a podcast. It's also linked on the Facebook page for COVID Calls and explains really the ambition of the series. You can keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for guests, topics, and please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, July 9th, 2020, there are 12,128,406 confirmed cases globally of COVID-19, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. That's up from 10,538,577 cases reported July 1st, when we did our last COVID Calls broadcast. Of those, 3,088,913 are in the United States, and that's up from 2,658,324 reported July 1st. There are now a total of 132,934 deaths from COVID-19 reported in the United States. That's up from 127,681 deaths reported on July 1st. As a way to bring some humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story or a story of advocacy for COVID-19 sufferers every day, and I'd like to continue that now. Headline: a woman, her brother, and their mother all lost to COVID-19. The virus's devastating toll on one DC area family. This is by Paul Dugan, was published May 2nd in the Washington Post. Having already tended to one burial and with two more to arrange, Shanta Leek Cherry was on the phone in April describing how the novel coronavirus came up like a foul wind and swept through her family. Her voice faltered and she said wearily, "You'll have to excuse me if I get a little emotional." 2 months ago, her sister, Nikki Leek, and Nikki's fiance, who lived together in Charles County, Maryland, were looking forward to their destination wedding in Hawaii, and now Nikki is dead. In March, before Nikki got sick, their 74-year-old mother, Leslie Leek, a retired postal clerk, was passing her golden days in contentment. She could be found assembling floral bouquets, singing softly to herself, and doting on her grandchildren and great-grandchildren when they visited Mama's immaculate old house in the district's Congress Heights neighborhood. Now Leslie is dead. Her son, John Leek Jr., 40, brother of Nikki and Shanta, moved into his parents' Congress Heights home about a year ago. And what a cut-up he was, always with jokes. The type of person, regardless of whether you're having a bad day, you can depend on him to make you laugh, Shanta said. He was our clown. I mean, you just couldn't help but be happy around him. Now, John Jr. is dead. Their 78-year-old father, John Leek Sr., a retired plumber and widower of Leslie, tested positive for the virus and was quarantined in the Congress Heights house after some frightful nights. He is feeling better, but Shanta worries. In the 600 block of Alabama Avenue Southeast, the tidy 2-story wood house that John and Leslie Leek shared for decades is painted pale green, with an elegant semi-turret on the front facade and a square of neatly trimmed grass. Relatives call it simply the house, a nickname for the place where they invariably gathered on holidays and special occasions. Birthdays, baptisms, graduations, and the big cookout every 4th of July when the Leeks got together. It was almost always at the house. Last spring, Nikki's daughter, Anaya, finished high school, and of course, Mama and Papa hosted a celebration, laying down a red carpet from the brick steps of the porch to the sidewalk. Folks loved it. Amid growing concern nationwide that the coronavirus is disproportionately hurting African Americans, the district's Ward 8, including Congress Heights and other neighborhoods east of the Anacostia River, is a case in point. Historically riven with social ills, drugs and crime, inadequate health care, and high unemployment, to name a few, the ward, nearly 90% Black, has Washington's worst rate of contagion fatalities, 6 per every 10,000 residents. By the end of April, 677 confirmed infections had been recorded in the ward, up from 259 a few weeks earlier, health officials said. On March 30th, Nikki's condition grew so grave so rapidly that the suburban medical center transferred her to the larger MedStar Georgetown University Hospital. We never got a chance to talk to her again, Shanta said. She was on a ventilator for about 2 weeks, and the virus kept attacking her. Leslie had asthma, as did John Jr., who also was having trouble breathing around the time of Nikki's death. They blamed it on pollen, on the allergies that aggravated their compromised respiratory functions every spring. Shanta wasn't sure. Often we self-diagnose, she said by phone. We shouldn't. On April 19th, they were wheezing and ambulances were summoned to the house. One took Leslie to George Washington University Hospital and the other carried John Jr. to Howard University Hospital. The mother and son both tested positive. Their illnesses followed different progressions in the days afterward, but ended the same way, each with a flat line on a bedside monitor. John Jr. worked in communications at the U.S. Postal Service headquarters and had part-time gigs at a grocery store and a hotel. He was a former culinary student, a foodie, and head chef for all events at the house on Alabama Avenue. His entire time in the hospital, almost, he was alert and talking and no doubt cracking jokes, Shanta said. Leslie was another story. The day after her mother was admitted, Shanta got a call from the hospital saying Leslie needed to be heavily sedated and intubated. From then on, she was never more than semi-conscious as doctors tried hydroxychloroquine and later the experimental drug remdesivir. The treatments were halted after she developed an irregular heart rate, Shanta said. The house, that favorite place of the extended Leeks, will probably go on the market after the crisis, Shanta said. She doesn't want her father in there without her mother because bad things, once unimaginable, can happen, she now knows. She said she plans to downsize John Sr. in the interest of safety and her own peace of mind. He'll come live with us, she said. I want to keep him close. There's more to that obituary I read, just a part of it, and you can find it in the Washington Post, and you can find it also on the US of Disaster Twitter site. I'd like to turn to our discussion today. I'm really thrilled to introduce my guests, and let me start with Daniel. Daniel Jose Older is the New York Times bestselling author of the middle grade historical fantasy series Dactyl Hill Squad, the Bone Street Rumba urban fantasy series Star Wars Last Shot, the Book of Lost Saints, and the award-winning young adult series The Shadow Shaper Cipher, which won the International Latino Book Award and was shortlisted for the Kirkus Prize in Young Readers Literature, the Andre Norton Award, the Locus, the Mythopoeic Award, and named one of Esquire's 80 books every person should read. He's a lead story architect on the Star Wars The High Republican Cross-Platform Initiative, and you can find out more and read more of his writings, including his writings about being a paramedic, on danieljoseolder.net.
Thanks for having me.
Malka Older, now a repeat. Great, thank you so much for being here, Daniel. Malka is a repeat guest to COVID Calls. This is her second visit. She was on a previous episode with the anthropologist Vivian Choi, and you can find that in our archives of podcasts. Great discussion. Malka is a writer, aid worker, and academic. Named Senior Fellow for Technology and Risk at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs for 2015, she has more than a decade of experience in humanitarian aid and development. Her research interests include intergovernmental relations in crises, the paradox of well-funded disaster response, measurement and evaluation of disaster response, and the effects of competition among actors in humanitarian aid. She's also a writer, and Malka Older's science fiction political thriller Infomocracy was named one of the best books of 2016 by Kirkus, Book Riot, and the Washington Post. She's also the author of the sequels Null States and State Tectonics. Her short story and poetry collection And Other Disasters came out in late 2019. Daniel and Malka, thank you so much for making time. Welcome to COVID Calls.
Thank you for having us.
Great to be here.
And thank you for doing this, Scott.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation today, and I want to remind everyone you can get your questions in. You can put them up if you're watching on YouTube Live, just put them in the YouTube Live chat, or you can put them up on Twitter. Just be sure to tag @US of Disaster. Sometimes people like to email them to me in the middle of the discussion. That's fine too. You can email me sgk23@drexel.edu. So I'd like to start the way I've been starting all of these calls and just find out where you're calling in from, what the COVID-19 situation is there. And in discussions in these last few weeks, we've also been talking about the reverberations of the George Floyd murder in terms of protests that may be going on where you are. So with that in mind, Malka, if I could start with you, where are you and how are things there?
I'm in The Hague in the Netherlands, and things here feel very much back to normal. In a terrifying way, but people are inside cafes and restaurants and out on the street shopping. The numbers are pretty low here. I think there were 52 confirmed cases in the country at the last count, and they're measuring the numbers who go into ICU and into hospitalization every day. It's 1 in 2 or 0 in there nationwide for a week or two. There are still, some concerns. Okay, I think we lost Scott. I'm just going to keep talking until he comes back. Sweet. There you are. The holiday season is starting up, and Europe's internal borders have mostly opened, except for Sweden and the UK, if we count that as Europe. I don't know. And so there's more travel going on, and there's some concerns about what's going to happen. But right now it's pretty low. There were some protests here during the early sort of rush of protests. I think they've mostly quieted down, and there was some talk about looking at the racism in the Netherlands as well. It's I think that, it came up here very much as a conversation, but it certainly hasn't lasted as long. And I think there's a lot of work to do here too, but at least it did come up, and there were some important discussions that started about that. And the protests were really impressive, actually.
Thanks for situating us into what's going on where you are. Malka, same question to you, Daniel. Where are you calling from, and what's going on there?
Yeah, I'm currently in New Orleans, Louisiana, and our numbers are starting to go back up like everywhere else. We had an initial spike that was very dramatic, and then the decline was also very dramatic. But as we went down, the larger state numbers started going up. And now they're going up pretty fast. They're more towards 2,000 new cases a day, more or less. We've stayed below 100 new cases a day, but it's definitely gone from like the single digits back up closer to 100 in the past week or so. So the death count is still in the single digits for statewide from what I've seen. But yeah, things are kind of ominous. And in terms of protests, we had a good amount of pretty solid protests from what I heard, and the cops stayed in line more so than in a lot of places. I think Mayor Cantrell has been pretty on point both about the COVID response and making sure that things don't get out of hand in the protests. And then there's been kind of a steady stream of smaller ones going on ever since then. You see them, on corners on a good number of nights a week. I think they've been trying to sustain just having people come out, even if it's a small crowd, just regularly. So it's ongoing.
Okay, so we've got in this call, we've got the East Coast, we've got the Gulf Coast, and we've got Europe represented in one call. So we've got some pretty interesting variability geographically here.
Yeah.
Today we're going to talk about fiction, and we're going to talk about making sense of disaster through fiction and writing. But to get there, I want to ask you both a little bit about your own background, maybe to understand a little bit of kind of what goes on, how you make your idea, where they're coming from, what you're drawing from, I guess. And Malka, I'm going to start with you. Find a little bit more about your background in humanitarian aid and in disaster management and disaster research. Why did you go into those fields? What kind of questions and concerns motivated you, still motivate you in those areas?
I really went into humanitarian work. I started working for NGOs because I wanted to learn more about the rest of the world and really, see how people lived in other places and how people thought in other places. And it was kind of a way for me to be learning about what was going on and meeting people and spending time in other places and, hoping that I could do some good as kind of a bonus. Honestly, which, I think it's so hard to do good that if you hang your entire reason for doing things on that, it can be really hard. And I wanted to learn about things. So I started doing work actually on the development side. And while I was working for a local NGO in Sri Lanka, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami hit the island. And so I was really thrown into the disaster response because you couldn't be there at the time. I couldn't be there at the time and not be involved in what was going on. It was a really massive event, and it was just very shocking and traumatic for everyone, I think. And I found the disaster response work really fulfilling and interesting, and met some people who were working in it and ended up picking up some more jobs. And after that, I went to Uganda briefly, and then I was in Darfur for a little over a year, which is a long-term complex emergency. I didn't want to get too burned out, so I went to do some more development work in Indonesia, also being aware that there would be disasters while I was there, because Indonesia is one of those places you can pretty much count on some kind of disaster. And there were, so I did some earthquake responses there. And then as I was there, I started doing more disaster risk reduction work. So that's more on the preventative and preparedness side. And did that for a little bit, ended up getting called up for the disaster response in Japan after the tsunami, because I spoke some Japanese from teaching English there a long time before. And that gave me some ideas for what I wanted to study for a PhD, looking really at, I mean, it was so different to be working in a country that didn't have very much of an international response, and to look at what that domestic response looked like in Japan, where the government was mostly handling it. I was working for a Japanese NGO, seconded, and it was really fascinating to see the differences. And so I began looking for my doctoral research on how mostly local and meso governments improvise their organizational structures after they have a collapse in the wake of a disaster. And I looked at that Japan tsunami, and I looked at Hurricane Katrina. And that was maybe a long answer, but it's kind of a complicated, winding path. So that can give you some sense of the different things that I've done and how I ended up where I am.
So if I had that right, then how many continents have you done response and disaster research on?
Yeah, most of them. I mean, I did.
Most, yeah.
Well, there were, because I was for a while, I was in a global position in which I traveled like constantly. And I also did a fair amount of consulting. So like, you know, yeah, it was a lot of different places. I've looked at disaster preparedness programs in the Solomon Islands, and I've written proposals for DRR in South America and Central America, and yeah, just kind of mostly all over.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure to speak to so many emergency managers and people who study emergency management, disaster doing COVID calls, and to find out how many of them were actually sort of in the field before they turned to doing maybe more theoretical work, more academic work. And one of the things that's emerged in those discussions, and I wonder what you think about it, is that really what we need are people who can do both, or who can it's hard to do everything, but who don't lose that sense of activism or the desire to do intervention and field work, but also have the kind of perspective that you have as a researcher. I worry about fatigue with people, you know, doing that kind of thing. But disaster research, it has theory, but there's an activist and an active core at the center of it too. Do you still consider yourself in both of those tents?
I mean, I don't know. It's a question of, you know, what's the statute of limitations of the last time I was in an active disaster area, unless you include, you know, the entire world right now. But I think that having had that experience is really important, because there is a shift in reality and in the way people relate to it when there's a major disaster. And it's very hard to understand that even the first time you're in it, let alone before you've ever been in it. And so, you know, I think one of the issues I find really, really fascinating that I'd like to see more work on in disaster studies is kind of, you know, this disconnect between the people who have done it before and are often kind of jaded and you know, that it can be a disadvantage in some ways as well, and the people who have never done it before and are either trying to work in a normal way and end up getting stuck and often having difficulties, and the people who or just like taking to it immediately, or maybe just being really overwhelmed. And you know, I feel like there's a cultural conflict there that I've seen happen in so many different places, and you know, within people of the same nationality and sometimes even subnational identity, in terms of just, you know, how familiar they are and how they react to that change of pace and that change of reality that happens in a disaster.
So thank you for that, Daniel. I want to turn to you, get a little bit of kind of the backstory before the writing. And I know that I saw on your website, you've written a little bit there about your previous work as a paramedic. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about that paramedic time period too. I think that's really relevant to where we are today.
Absolutely. And I got into that knowing that I was going to end up doing creative work. Wait until I started talking to Stella. Stella, stop.
Older 2020. Why are you like this? Sorry.
I knew I was going to do creative work. I wasn't sure what direction yet, and I knew it was also a very practical decision. I knew I needed a job that would pay my rent after college, and it was something I was always really interested in, but didn't really know exactly what direction it would go. I also knew that as an artist, there was going to be a temptation, or there was a temptation always, to sort of feel like you're on the outside of something, looking in and describing it, and that there's such a danger in that idea because you never are really outside of anything. And I felt like I wanted a job that was very much like wouldn't let me be under that impression, like wouldn't let me kind of labor under that mythology of ever being outside something. A job that would very much put me like right in the streets in the middle of what was happening. Sorry. I got into it with that kind of philosophy in the back of my mind, and what I didn't really know was how much healing happens of the self as we're healing other people. Like when you tell people you're a medic, it's always like, oh wow, like how do you sleep at night? Which Malcolm, I'm sure you get that too. Like wow, the shit you must have seen, right? And you're like, I don't know. I was always like, I sleep great. You know what I mean? Like I save people's lives for a living. I sleep amazingly. That's not to discount that, like we do indeed see really terrible things, but I think it's the word "see" that really is tricky. What we don't do actually is just see things. Like as a medic and as a person involved in any kind of disaster relief, you're very actively involved, and that's what I didn't know going in was just how deeply the active part is a mechanism of self-healing and cleansing, really. And it's like so you are taking part in someone's healing process, and by doing that, you are also recovering from your own trauma of dealing with it face to face. It's very different than walking out into the street and seeing someone get hit by a truck and not having your gear with you and not being able to do anything. And that's something I just think we really misunderstand when we look at it from the outside. When we see like what response workers, the gallows humor and the sort of idea that like we just have to close off our hearts, and it's really the opposite. Really what it is we all have to find our balance. And I think this is true of humanity in general right now, especially, and it's always been true of people who live in marginalized communities, is we all have to find our balance about how to survive in a world full of trauma, a world that doesn't love us back very often, and a world that is, constantly in crisis. And how do we live, in that space of knowing that to be true, knowing that, you could be midway through eating a slice of pizza and then have to deal with a child who's been shot. And not let it break you or harden you to the point that you can't do your job or go through your daily life. And that's the sort of balancing act that they don't teach you about in medic school. And they, because of toxic masculinity and other things, it's hard to have those conversations unless you have a great partner, on the ambulance. And that was really just sort of the complicated journey of being a medic. I did it for 10 years and I loved it every single year, and I'm so glad that I left before I got burnt out and did what I had to do. But I also went in knowing that I wasn't going to do it forever, and that the path was always out and into a creative field. I just wasn't sure what.
I think
interesting the way you describe that. Go ahead, Malcolm.
No, please.
You have sibling privilege. You should definitely.
No, I think that's so true about being active in it, and gosh, I think that's something that really should be something that people can experience, and it doesn't have to be necessarily like in emergency things, but being active, engaging with people, and helping with people. I mean, and in a lot of ways, these are the kinds of professions that are now, they're not as prestigious. They don't get paid that well. And yet they're so fundamental for everyone involved. But yeah, for me, I mean, going back to the question that you asked me and tying this in, it was actually, I had much more trouble emotionally dealing with it when I was studying disaster as a researcher than when I was working on it and in it every day. Because even though like disaster response, the whole humanitarian industry, like it's very messy. And I meant it when I said it before, you cannot count on doing good. you try really hard, but it's really messy and there are really ugly moments in it. But even there, at least, you're there trying and you're engaging with people, and, to go out and talk to people about their trauma And the best I could offer them would be that, like, probably my advisor would read the whole dissertation. It just felt like I was contributing so little compared to what I was getting, what people were sharing with me. And I found that much more difficult to deal with emotionally than being very much in the thick of it.
Right. Yeah, and that was a really revelatory moment for me on the ambulance, was having, we would have brains on the sidewalk and just all kinds of gruesome stuff, and we would walk away okay. It was the case where it was a child who was sexually abused, who all we did was take the girl to the hospital, and she was emotionally and physically presented okay, when we got to her, and she gave us high fives, you know what I mean? And we dropped her off, and we gave her our report, and we filled out all the paperwork, and we did all the bureaucratic things that you have to do and everything else. And that's what crushed me. And it's because all that paperwork could amount to literally nothing. She could go right back into that situation. That's beyond my everything to do. I just had to drop her off and say goodbye. And there was, it's not even like you could do something and fail at it. There was just nothing to do. Like, that paperwork ain't it. And so I just remember leaving that day from work and just kind of like I just felt like I'd been hit by a truck, you know what I mean? And it was such a disconnect because, like I said, I'd seen so many horrible things, but I had been able to try to treat them. Even if the patient didn't make it, I had played my role in doing whatever I could to bring that person back to life. And I knew going in, they probably weren't going to make it, but this is like a whole other thing, like way beyond. And that was it's that helplessness, and I do think, I felt it back then. I feel it even more now. But just the way that we can be traumatized by watching the news, by dealing with, who's in office, everything. Like it is a form of trauma, and then particularly the more we feel helpless about it, And I think that's what led me to activism. That's what led me to writing. I think activism and writing are actually the same thing in many ways. I think we can have very concrete ideas of what activism is and isn't, and that to our detriment. But to me, like taking an action, whatever it may be, whether it's like, sometimes it's literally a tweet, and sometimes it's getting your friends together, at this point online only, whatever, like whatever it is, like it's something that doesn't make you feel totally victimized and passive by the nightly news, by the ongoing crisis on the news. Like that's all connected. The work as being a medic or being a disaster coordinator, and that is very much the same story.
You're both telling me something that I find surprising. And I guess I hadn't quite put this together, thinking about artists also who've been in war. But my assumption is that to go through the kind of trauma, to be in the disaster zone, Malka or Daniel, to be in the ambulance, that you build a carapace, that you have to create some invulnerability in order to do the work. But somehow that seems to me at odds with the vulnerability required to be an artist. And to be a writer who, you open yourself and you make yourself vulnerable to readers who can say, hey, I like that or I don't like that. And I don't know, maybe I've gone into this with the wrong preconceptions about the relationship between trauma and writing, but I've always thought that maybe people who've seen those kind of things, they kept it to themselves, or that wasn't the good precondition for being in that wavelength that a writer is. You're telling me something different.
Yeah, I think it's the opposite of I think if you find your way toward balance, it becomes the opposite of any kind of shielding, and it really becomes that because you can't do the job if you're overly protective of yourself either. You can't do the job if you're thinking about the last patient, and you can't do the job if you don't care about patients at all.
Interesting.
Yeah, if you get super jaded, like I said before, if you have no idea what's going on and you're overwhelmed and freaked out, that's a problem. But if you've done it a million times and nothing surprises you anymore, and you can't show that you care or that you're surprised by anything, that's no good. Right. But I think there's something else to it too, which is, for me, being a writer, and this is a kind of vulnerability, but maybe a different way of talking about it, but you have to be present, right? You have to be observing what's going on. You have to be really seeing and experiencing things, because otherwise, how are you going to describe them or draw anything from them in terms of insight? And so doing things that are active, that are engaged, that take you out of your comfort zone, to me is really fundamental for being a writer. And that, that again, that does not have to be going into a disaster zone. There's lots of ways that you can be active and engaged, with your family, and with, I don't know, a hobby. Like, as long as it is something that takes you outside of a routine and makes you look around, I think that's the opening that you need. And I also think, for me, the vulnerability of being a writer is not so much what readers are going to think. I mean, yeah, I want people to like it and I want people to say good things about it, but I don't know. I have much more confidence to face that part of things because I had this whole other career that was, in some ways a lot more challenging in terms of getting things right. Yeah. And so, I mean, I won't say it doesn't affect me at all, but I have so much more confidence than I would have, I think, if I had done what I wanted to do right out of college and become an instant writer success, right? So I'm really, I feel like that's a real strength.
It's that, and it's all of that, absolutely. And it's also that both jobs, and I think any job in emergencies, requires you to analyze the situation deeply in order to figure out what action to take. And yes, there's time, with the jaded piece, that the result of being jaded is you walk into a room and see a patient with chest pain and decide automatically what it is without looking deeper, or you, whatever situation you're going into, you don't do a proper power analysis of what's going on around you and what are the different ways that you have to get yourself out of it or get the patient out of it or whatever it might be. And that to me is like such a perfect metaphor for what's often lacking in the conversations about writing well. We don't, in MFA classes and in writing guides and stuff, we don't talk enough about power and power analysis and listening. To me, those are the two fundamental pieces of writing that we just let slide so often because they're very uncomfortable conversations for people. It means we have to deal with privilege and all these things that people write over letters and talk about, and they're so fundamental. You can't be a writer of any worth if you're not thinking deeply about power. It doesn't matter if you're writing fantasy or essays or what. If you're not thinking about power, you're not going to write a good story. Why? Because conflict is at the heart of all the stories we're telling, and you have to have a power analysis to understand conflict. And to me, that's being a medic is understanding what are the powers that play within the human body, and what are the powers that play within the bureaucracies that we're managing and dealing with, and how are we going to get through them and survive them for ourselves at the end of the day, and get our patients to safety at the end of the day. If you're not analyzing that stuff, you're failing. And the same is true if you're doing, even more so, if you're doing coordination and you're dealing with different governments and bureaucracies and all these things. That's how you also become a writer.
And for me too, I mean, on my side, like the international side, for me, fundamentally, I came to this sort of humanitarian principle, because we call it humanitarianism, but it's become almost an idiom that we don't think about what that word means. But for me, there's this fundamental thing that it's looking at everyone around us as human, whether they're a combatant, whether they're non-combatant, whether they're rich or poor, they were affected by this disaster, and we need to look at them as human and treat them that way. And I think that is also, the fundamental principle I see in my writing, because you need to have human characters, and all of your characters should be human. Because when you start writing cliches, when you see the person with chest pains and assume it's one thing, when you have to write a security guard and you assume it's going to be a man who looks a certain way, then you're falling down on the job.
Which is bad writing.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, it's bad writing.
On top of being going all the other stuff.
So yeah, for me, they're really connected.
I want to remind people that you're listening to COVID Calls and this really fascinating conversation we're having with Daniel Jose Older and Malka Older about fiction and creativity in COVID-19. I want to make that turn now to the pandemic. One of the reasons I wanted to talk with both of you was really actually to see if you could unpack for us a little bit how readers, potentially writers, can be in this time, how they can use reading or writing as a way to cope or make sense of what we're all going through. And I think what you were just talking about in that last round there, to me, amazing. You're talking about things that we're often looking to newspapers to try to sort out. Power. Who's calling the shots right now, and who's falling down on the job? Who's being murdered, and who's doing the murdering, and who's going to decide what happened? And then listening, Daniel, you said, and that's such to me an important, and the sort of attentiveness to the human experience, which, even reading these obituaries, which I've been doing on COVID calls, every time I do that, I'm somehow, and this is just me, but somehow reconnecting to something that even in the course of a single day can become abstract again.
Mm-hmm.
I've been fortunate enough to not be ill and not be touched by it in my family. But that reconnection is always crucial, it seems like. So I guess I want to turn to you, Malka. Let me ask you first about that, just not asking for some grand theory, but just how you even come into this space of like thinking about the pandemic through creativity.
So I think this is, for me, this is really an answer where I think creativity is so important for dealing with, well, I think it's just important in general, but especially for dealing with stuff like this. But I also think it's very, very much a your mileage may vary situation, which is why I really wanted to bring in Daniel or someone else so that it wasn't just me, because honestly, I think people use it in very, very different ways. And that's part of why we have the wonderful panoply of literature that we do have. Like in terms of my reading, I've been super just like, I want to say cozy, but they're not cozy in the sense of like cozy mysteries, because the cozy books I've been going to, one of them is the Martha Wells Murderbot series, which is not cozy, but it's so cozy. So I've just, I've been reading books that I know are not going to rip my heart out.
Right.
And authors that I trust, and things that I know will give me a good voice and a good story, and that will keep me going. But that's me. And I know other people who need to read things at times like this that will rip their heart out, because it's different getting it ripped out through fiction than it is in real life. And that can be, it can be a cathartic thing. It can be a sort of displacement thing. So I really want to say, however it works for you is great. For me, the reading is partly escapism. I think there's also a degree to which, some of it also provides some analysis, some distance, some sense of that people deal with things, some hope in that sense. The reminder that this moment in time is not the only moment, and that people, generations of humans have gone through really terrible things in the past in many different places. And this is not the only terrible thing. And that's, I think, a really important thing to remember. So that's the reading side. And I'll let Daniel go on that too, and then we'll talk about the writing side.
Yeah, for reading, I'm pretty similar to you, Malka. Like I think the first thing I did was pick up some of the Shambhala and different Buddhist texts that I had read at different moments from my own personal struggles, and found a lot of solace in, and in a very practical way, just like sit in meditation, returning to that, because I just kind of go in and out of it very often. But and just very practically understanding sort of presentness, and presentness through bad times. Pema Chodron has this book, When Things Fall Apart, that is such a crucial and excellent read. So it was that, I was juggling that, and then like my comfort reads are like Dr. Aphra, Star Wars, the comic book series, and stuff that I just know is like really good, like really just feeds me, because I don't really reread a lot of stuff, but that's just a series that I love so much, so I picked that up. Recently I read Andrea Hairston's amazing upcoming book, Master of Poisons, which is the heavier end of things that I've read, because it does deal with a lot of disasters and people trying to just fight off great horrible things, but it does it in such a beautiful and poetic way, with so much hope infused in it, that it really worked. But then what I said was the other thing I've been doing is gaming, which I haven't done since I was like 10. We used to together, Zelda first. And so yeah, I've been playing Breath of the Wild, which is an incredible game. And it's so, and I do think there's a piece of it that is just like it's very immersive, because you make decisions for the hero. You are the hero, so you're living it and embodying it. And just particularly with a game like that that's open world, where you're just like, where do I want to wander around today? And you get to go play in this other world, and it's just so great. So yeah, I've been having a good time with that. Definitely.
But let's talk a little bit then on the writing side. I just wanted one thing I wanted to throw in there. Thanks for listing the things you're reading. That's tremendous. And I reread Camus' *The Plague*, and I read for the first time.
Right? I know.
I know. Whatever. I'm gonna confess. You confessed. I'm gonna confess. But reading the Journal of the Plague Year, Daniel Defoe's Journal of Plague Year, which anybody can find online for free, about the 1666 London.
Right.
Plague, to me, it was, and Malka, it really resonates with something you said. And I was asked by students yesterday, what can we learn from history about COVID-19? And my answer, and I always struggle with this, I want to be able to give you like the 1, 2, 3 quick things. But you know what? I've learned more from literature and reading plague literature about humanity in this time. And particularly this issue that's given me a lot of concern is how people are coping with distance and suffering and distance and death at a distance. And it came up even in an obituary that I read. And this is not the first time we've dealt with this. We've had to deal with it in different times and places in different ways. And so that was another way I found literature as a reader really sustaining and helping me make some sense of something that I couldn't even put it in the form of a thought before I read it in Defoe. So that's reading. Let's talk about writing. And then you're both going to read something for us too, I think, as well.
We have time.
Okay. Malka, go ahead.
Yeah, the writing. I mean, I told you last time I was here that I'd really dived into some of my work in progress and was feeling pretty productive because it was an escape for me. But it's an escape in a different way from the reading, because I can't, you can't go cozy when you're writing. I mean, you can if that's the book you're writing, but the thing that works for me, the thing that has been really helpful for me with the creativity is that you do have to immerse yourself. And that comes back to what I was saying before about how the characters have to be human. You have to get yourself into that place where you can say, if these are real people, what are they doing next? And this situation, the work I had in progress, what I was working on when this all happened was actually a book very much about disasters. So that's fun. But it's a different world, and I need to figure out that world as I go, and I need to figure out the characters as I go and their interactions. And so, when I lie down in bed and my brain wants to freak out, I have a place I can go, which is to say, what happens next to this person? What does this person do next? What is the weird thing that's going to come up in this setting, or what is the thing that these people are going to come together to do, and how does that take them to the next step? And that's just been, for me, a really powerful way of, I think it's getting my brain to work sometimes on some of these related fears and anxieties and issues and grief. And sometimes not, sometimes it's just telling a story, a part of the story that's not so tied into it, which is also fine. And sometimes it's working it out in a weird parallel way. But for me, that's been really, really useful. And yeah, whatever is the part of the story that my brain feels like digging into, that's the part of the story I'm going to think about and then eventually write on, wherever it comes in the actual eventual chronology of this weird story that who knows. But yeah, it's been really helpful for me.
I was laughing because those of us who write dark horror adjacent fiction or just like twisted shit, it's like that, like for any,
I knew you couldn't do it, Daniel.
Whatever. For any creative, that's exactly what you said. Like where we go to in our head when we're trying not to think about how horrible things are is our creative project, but when we write all this stuff, that's it's like go to your happy place.
It is.
That's the happy place. Yeah.
But yeah,
it's different.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I was gonna ask Malka. You have to go right on the hour.
I told them that I might be a few
see
minutes
where we
late.
are on time.
I don't want to keep them waiting more than 5 or 10 minutes, but.
Okay. If it's okay with you, I mean, I thought maybe you could give a short reading. Does that still seem realistic?
We can. I don't know. I kind of feel like, hmm?
I said it's more fun talking.
Yeah, I kind of feel like, you know, people can read our books,
Okay.
but but they can't. Yeah, I don't have my book. Read my book, but they can't hear our thoughts except when we're talking about them publicly. So
Right.
I don't know. I would say let's keep chatting and then see what happens. But I'm happy to read if that's what you. Thank you, Daniel. Oh, you're the best. Look,
No, this is good. Well, I just wanted to make sure that we got a sense that the listeners got a sense of the work, and I mean they can just from this conversation with you.
You can read the beginning of my book for free on Tor.com, and probably excerpts from Daniel somewhere too.
Yeah, I have a bunch of stuff on Tor too.
Google us. I have lots of free stories available online that are linked from my WordPress page. You know,
so that first story.
Happy to read, but
yeah, the story that's up on Tor.com, Malka, I wanted to ask you just a little bit about it because people can grab that. It's from your 2019 book and Other Disasters, and is it called The Divided? Is that the title of it?
Yeah. You know it, Daniel. That's the one I read that time.
Could you?
Oh yeah, I love that story.
Yeah.
It's an amazing story, and I think people will go find it and read it. Can I ask you just to say a little bit, even just about that, sort of take us a little bit into how your mind works as a writer.
Yeah.
Details you chose in there are amazing. I mean, I also was thinking, that book and Other Disasters that came out in 2019, you didn't have a pandemic in mind. That book will be seen as a pandemic book, probably. I mean, that's the disaster that's on everybody's mind, but you had other disasters in mind. And
I did.
Not just natural ones.
I'd mostly worked, and not just natural ones. I will just, as an aside, as a shout out, if you want a book about this moment that came out in 2019, read Sarah Pinsker's A Song for a New Day, because it is an amazing, hopeful, really interesting and rich book that just has a lot to say about the present moment. It includes a pandemic. It's not only about the pandemic, but the result is very much about distance and community. Putting that shout out there. And also thank you to everyone who's saying hello to us in the comments. It's nice to see all your faces and comments. But your question, so this story is called The Divided. It's actually, I was asked to write it for a horror anthology about the moment after the 2016 elections. And I don't really write horror that much. Some people think my novel is dystopian and horrific. I think it's kind of hopeful, probably because I'm more cynical than most people, I guess. But that one, I started out thinking, how can I write horror in a speculative way when there's so much real life horror in the world right now? How do I write something that's both about what's going on, but that's, I could just write the stories in the newspaper. It's hard. And I just, I thought about it, and that was a story that really, it basically wrote itself. I just was lying there at night thinking, and as soon as I had the thought of how it would look, I just got up and wrote the story. And I did a little bit of work on it later to make it stronger, but the basic story was there right away, I think, because it was really one of those moments when it was a channeling of that horror, that real life horror, and that emotion and the grief into, a way to I think what's the power of speculative fiction, particularly, sometimes other kinds of fiction can do this as well, but especially speculative fiction, the power of it is a trick mirror. It's something that you look at and you have reactions to what you're seeing before you figure out that it is a reflection of yourself and of your society and of the time you live in. Our books about the future are not about the future, they're about the present, but it's a way of getting people to think about the present differently. Similarly, alternate history books or fantasy books, they're all, just tricks for us to get, and the books that I love the most are the ones that I I find, 80% of the way through or something, feel that moment of this is what they're trying to say and this is how it relates to my life now. Right. Even though I've been enjoying this as, an adventure in a dragon world up till this point. Right. So, for me, that was the feeling with that particular story. And
thank you. I do hope people will read that.
I hope they will. And there's also a really cool project that was done with it by this group called the Disquiet Junto that does some experimental music. And they took a recording of my voice reading the story and then asked all the musicians all over the world to make a soundtrack using only my voice as the instrument. Wow. So you can look that, yeah, I know, it's so cool. So you can look that up on the Disquiet. It's Junto with a J and an O for some reason at the end. And if you want to listen to the story with a soundtrack, it's up there.
Malka, you have set the bar impossibly high for disaster researchers. This is like weird, and it's not fair, but I really love what you're describing. It's tremendous. And Daniel, I wonder if you might share something with us about something you've written lately or one of your works. Give us a little bit of behind the scenes, just like Malka did. What was going through your mind? What were you working out?
Well, one thing I'll say in terms of process, there's a lot that I do now that I've always done, but now it takes on a deeper resonance and necessity because of what's going on. And the main thing is to come back to this idea of listening. I just find it so important. I'm a big advocate of some form of journaling as a partner to writing for other people. I think, I don't think it has to be in like a formal book with a lock and a key or, anywhere else, except that we have to get things off our chest and to move towards the writing space with intentionality. Otherwise, we can kind of like trip over our own feet trying to get there in a hurry. And that's one of the things I talk and write about a lot is the idea that writing really begins with forgiveness and forgiving of ourselves first and foremost, because it's so easy to take on all these voices that say to us, like you should have been writing more. You're not a real writer unless you publish or unless you write every day or any kind of assorted bullshit rules that people make up to give you a particular title.
Right.
But you're a writer if you write. If you write, you're a writer. Like there's no you don't clock in and then get to call yourself a writer because you did it a certain number of times. Like that's not how it works. And I think it's important to say it out loud and to know that, there are months and months when I don't write, and I consider myself prolific, and I don't set out to be prolific. I just love writing, and I write. In part, I write so much because I take breaks, and that's a very healing part of being a working writer. That they act like you're not supposed to do, which is really how people burn out, which is really how people stop being writers because they're burnt out because they were trying to write every single day. And I think that's very dangerous. Some people it works for, but the idea that it's this like headline banner that is how you get to call yourself a writer is bullshit. So that, and then I just really think it's important to put your thoughts on the page. Again, so you're not just trying to jump onto the page immediately and start writing, just sit with yourself, with your thoughts. Sometimes I'll play a whole song all the way through and make myself not write just so I can settle in and be still and be present with my coffee before I really jump in. So all those things I think are really important. The project I just finished working on is something that's a co-written project, which I've really been enjoying with my good friend Baba Malik Duncan, who's a priest in my community, San Pedro of Alegba. And we've been working on this graphic novel together that comes out from Abrams in 2022. And it's about death coming back to the world every 1,000 years to spend 24 hours with its child. And this year, the child was kidnapped. So when it shows up at the door to the house where the child is supposed to be, the child is gone. And this kind of shadowy organization of different religious elders has to jump into action to find the kid. So it's very pressing because, the assumption is kind of like if death doesn't get to spend the day with its kid, everyone's gonna die. No one dies on death's day, but the next day everyone's gonna die. Yeah. So the concept originally came from Malik, and then we developed it together into this really wild noir story. And I know he wasn't thinking about this year in particular when he wrote it, but here we are writing it.
Is that out now? Can we read that now?
No, it comes out in 2022. I'm afraid to say it has to be right now. What's really cool? I know. I'm sorry. I know. No, I just finished writing it.
Start tweeting it out now. Like, we need to read it now.
I shouldn't even.
That's really amazing.
I don't even have a pre-order link yet. It's terrible.
Amazing premise.
But it's really amazing, and it's been so much fun to develop. And the really cool thing is, on top of it being a collaboration between us, which has been really fun, now it comes the really great part where the illustrator, Chuck Collins, comes in and starts drawing it. So we're all in a WhatsApp group together and bouncing, pictures back and forth, and it's just so much fun. And I've been enjoying that so much. And then the other collaborative thing I'm involved in is the Star Wars initiative, which is also just really fun to every week get to jump on a Zoom call. Which I genuinely dread, but this one's a lot of fun, and it's really fun because it's just like Star Wars nerds talking about Star Wars, and we get to create this whole new era in Star Wars history and just have a great time. So the collaborative aspect of creativity has really been happening for me right now in a way that's very fun, and I think we need to tear down this myth of the writer as like this just like sad,
drunk,
old
man.
Right, old white man in a cabin, like
in a country that's not his own because it's cheaper for him to live there.
All this.
Oh no, and not typing. His wife is typing. Sorry, I have a problem with Hemingway.
That's a stereotype. That's what really happens.
Yeah,
big Hemingway fan, are you?
I want to just agree with Daniel on a couple of things here. Taking time off. I take 24 hours off every week that I don't let myself write, and again, your mileage may vary, like do your thing, but especially at a time when all the schedules have fallen apart, I find that really useful. I started doing it when I was a PhD student and there were no schedules, and it's really helpful. Also, any kind of writing that works for you, like I think what Daniel brought up with the Star Wars is a nice segue to say also, if you don't have the headspace to do an entire world build, write fan fiction. Go to a place that you love in your head and write about those characters. And that's, if that's what works for you, that's fantastic. And also can there's
some of the biggest franchises in the world started
as fan fiction. I mean, that can take you to the other place, but it is also good enough as in its own. Like it's a great thing to do. I love the world building part and I love doing my own stuff, but I wrote a Orphan Black sequel with Cereal Box last year, and it was so much fun. And that's the other thing that what Danny was talking about, the collaborative. I love working on my own sometimes. I love being on my own head and building the whole thing. I also have really loved the experience of working collaboratively with other writers and throwing ideas around. So, there's so many ways that you can use creativity in your life to get that kick, to get engaged, to get your brain working on different tracks than the track of just watching the news and freaking out about it every night. Right. So, experiment and find what works for you.
Sure.
So we're almost up on time, but I want to underline a couple of things that some of the people writing in, Labyrinth Rat and Jorge Benavides.
Labyrinth Rat is also a writer who's a great writer, also a Cuban writer like us.
Hey.
Cool. Great. Yeah, they're pointing out the rapport between the two of you, which is fun to watch, and also I think this sort of like the joy of that's still possible, even though we're talking about death a lot right now. But even just listening to you both talk about your background and how you come into writing and how you think about, and your description there, Malka lying there at night thinking, what's going to happen next to these characters, and giving ourselves the freedom to imagine those possibilities in those worlds. It just seems so crucial right now as a form of coping. And I don't know. I mean, it's maybe sort of final words here as we close out. Is that particularly true, do you think, in times of trauma and distress and pandemic, this massive global shared experience we're having now? I mean, should people be taking up a creative practice, even if they haven't done it before? I mean, it seems like it would be an essential thing almost to prescribe to people in this moment. Take up painting or knitting or writing or whatever it takes to get your head into some other space out of this rumination zone that we find ourselves in so often.
I was thinking about Walter Mosley saying that he feels like everybody should write a book, but not everybody should publish that book. Which is like real, because you learn. Someone else once said, I cannot for the life of me remember who, but writing the book is basically the process by which you become the writer you need to be to finish the book. And that is a word. That's so true. Like you really do have to step up to finish that book on a different level. You have to learn, along with, it's the story of the character, but it's the story of the writer too, stepping up to become the writer that we need to be. And that helps whether you're a professional writer or not. Like that's an amazing thing to go through in the best possible way. It's an amazing journey to go on. So yeah, I mean, this is the year to write your book. Right? But no, I don't think it has to be that. It can be so many different things, but I would say
it can be so many different things. And I did just feel like, when you,
sorry.
Sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
I kept thinking at the beginning of this how, when you read books from England, like just after the Great War, and they say about people, he had a good war or he had a bad war. And there's so much variety in it. And I think that that's so much the case now. And people are having very different experiences. So listen, if you are totally swamped, do not feel like you have to take a creative practice right now. If it works for you. If you are not swamped and your brain is running around in circles, it's a great thing to try. And be forgiving of yourself, do things that are fun for you. Sometimes when I haven't recently, but sometimes when I have time, I paint because I have, the writing, it's my job and I want to make it good. I've learned how to be forgiving of myself in the writing too, so it doesn't bother me too much, but sometimes it's nice to go do something that's totally different that I have zero ego share in, and I can just and it focuses my mind because I want to make the line go that way. I have no idea how to do it. Right. So, there's that kind of concentration. And then there's I'm writing a novel and it could take me 3 months, but that's going to be a really fun, immersive journey for me. Whatever works with your situation. And also there are lots of things out there that if this is something you're interested in doing that can help you. I'm fond of NaNoWriMo, the National Novel Writing Month, and they've been putting out a lot of stuff for people who are in quarantine. To give them roots to writing. There are lots of other ones as well if that one doesn't work for you. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's a really useful approach.
That's great.
I would say too, just like
people are doing it. I think people are taking this. My father-in-law, who I didn't realize was a songwriter, I just found out in the last couple of days, has written 3 songs.
Oh, cool.
I know people have taken up poetry in this time. I mean, I do think it is. It's, as you said, Malka, if you're swamped, don't feel the additional obligation to take up a creative practice right now. But I do feel like people are reacting. I feel like there is that sense of finding that creativity through words. Daniel, I'm going to give you the last word and we're going to wrap up.
It's a time when the world itself is shedding its skin and it's painful and it hurts and there's a lot of disaster around that. It's also an amazing time. There's change. We can feel it. There's monuments falling that have been up for our entire lifetimes that many of us never dreamed we would see fall. And I think the more that we can lean into that positive change that is happening in the world and in ourselves, the better off we are. We are all shapeshifters, and we're seeing the world shift its shape very dramatically. And it's as scary as it is, it does ultimately mean a better future for our kids. And if we take that onto ourselves, each of us, that's how the world changes.
And we need to tell those stories.
Right, exactly.
You've been listening to COVID Calls. I want to remind you, COVID Calls is on every Monday through Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about the COVID-19 situation in Sweden with the historian Johan Gardebo. Cannot wait to talk with Johan about that. And I want to thank my guests. What a great hour, Malka Older and Daniel Jose Older. Wonderful to be with you. Thanks a million for coming on.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah.
Stay healthy, everyone. We'll talk to you tomorrow at 5 o'clock.